Picture the icy Baltic Sea in 1945, and one number freezes the soul: 1,500. That's how many people died when the Titanic sank in 1912, and it's the benchmark we measure every shipwreck against. But on January 30th, 1945, a single torpedo strike in the Baltic Sea killed more than 9,000 people in less than an hour. That's 6 times the Titanic's death toll, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. The ship was called the Wilhelm Gustloff. If you've never heard that name, you're not alone. Outside of Germany, almost no one has. To understand how a tragedy this massive stayed hidden for decades, we need to go back to where this ship's story begins. The Wilhelm Gustloff was launched in May 1937 in Hamburg, built not for profit but for propaganda. It was part of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, a state-run leisure initiative designed to show German workers the supposed superiority of the regime through subsidized cruises. At 684 feet long, it could carry 1,465 passengers and 400 crew. The ship featured swimming pools, a movie theater, sun decks, and dining rooms meant to rival any luxury liner on the Atlantic. Every voyage was carefully photographed, every smiling worker a testament to Nazi social policy. For 2 years, the Gustloff sailed the Baltic and the Norwegian coast, ferrying factory workers and their families on state-sponsored vacations. But within 2 years, the cruises would stop forever. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within days, the Wilhelm Gustloff was stripped of its peacetime purpose. The regime repainted it hospital ship white and dispatched it to the Baltic to retrieve wounded soldiers from the Polish campaign. By November, the white paint was gone. The ship was now gray, its luxury fittings torn out, its cabins converted into cramped quarters for naval cadets. The Gustloff became a floating barracks, anchored in the port of Gotenhafen, training young men to crew U-boats in the Atlantic. It never left the harbor. Month after month, new recruits cycled through its halls, learning torpedo mechanics and navigation in classrooms that once held vacationing families. For 5 years, it sat in port, training young submariners who would never see the end of the war. On January 12, 1945, the Red Army launched a massive offensive across the Vistula River. Within 48 hours, Soviet forces had advanced 100 miles into German-held territory. East Prussia, cut off from the rest of the Reich, became a pocket of panic. 2.5 million German civilians lived in the region, most of them farmers and small-town families who'd never considered leaving. Now Soviet tanks were 30 miles from the coast and closing fast. Roads west were already clogged with refugees, and the temperature had dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. By January 20, the Red Army had reached the Frisches Hof, a frozen lagoon separating East Prussia from the sea. Entire villages were abandoned in hours. Families loaded what they could onto horse-drawn carts and joined columns stretching for miles, but most roads led nowhere. The ports of Danzig, Gotenhafen, and Pillau were the only exits left. Trains couldn't run because the tracks were bombed or overrun. Boats were the last option. The Reich had one choice left: move everyone who could still escape by sea. On January 21st, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered the largest maritime evacuation in recorded history. It was called Operation Hannibal. Every available vessel in the Baltic, military or civilian, was to be commandeered for refugee transport. Over the next 15 weeks, more than 1,000 ships made the crossing from East Prussia to ports in western Germany and Denmark. Cargo steamers, fishing trawlers, icebreakers, even barges were pressed into service. The Navy estimated 2.2 million people were evacuated before the ports fell. It worked because the Red Army focused on land advances first, giving the operation a narrow window. But the Baltic in winter was lethal on its own. Ice floes could crush a hull, storms came without warning, and Soviet submarines had begun patrolling the shipping lanes. Ships left overloaded, often in the dark, with no escort and outdated charts. Dozens sank from mechanical failure, weather, or mines. The Wilhelm Gustloff, sitting in Gotenhafen harbor, was about to be pressed into service for the first time in years. On January 21st, Naval Command designated the Gustloff as an official evacuation transport. The plan was straightforward: load wounded soldiers from a nearby hospital ship, pick up submarine trainees still quartered on board, and carry them west to Kiel. The rated capacity was 1,465 passengers, though wartime transport rules allowed up to 1,800. The ship hadn't sailed in 5 years. Engines were functional but untested under load. Lifeboats had been removed early in the war for military use, leaving only 12 boats and 22 rafts for a vessel 684 feet long. The crew assigned to her that week had never worked together. By January 25th, the loading was supposed to begin in an orderly fashion. Military personnel first, then essential evacuees with paperwork. A departure was scheduled for January 28th, weather permitting. Everything was planned, everything was logged. But the docks were already packed with people who had walked for days through the snow. The refugees came from everywhere, from Königsberg, from Elbing, from Danzig itself. Families who'd walked 60, 80, sometimes 100 miles through snow that was waist-deep in places, temperatures hovering around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. They carried suitcases that froze to their hands. Mothers held infants wrapped in whatever fabric they could find. Children got separated in the crush and wandered the docks alone, calling names no one answered. By the time they reached Gotenhafen, many were already injured. Frostbite had blackened fingers and toes. Some collapsed from exhaustion or starvation and were trampled where they fell. Witnesses described scenes that didn't look real. Thousands of people pressed against the harbor gates, entire families sleeping on frozen concrete, elderly men and women who'd given up and simply sat in the snow waiting to die. The ship's officers knew they couldn't take everyone, but the alternative was leaving them to the Soviets. The boarding turned into chaos within hours. Officers tried to maintain order, checking papers, organizing by priority. Military personnel first, then wounded soldiers, then women with children, but the gates broke. People stormed the gangways. They climbed ropes, squeezed through portholes, bribed crew members with jewelry and cash. The ship's official capacity was 1,800 passengers. By the evening of January 29th, estimates put the number aboard at 10,600. The Gustloff's empty swimming pool, drained for the war, was packed with bodies standing shoulder to shoulder. Stairwells became impassable. Cabins designed for 2 people held 15, some sitting, some standing, children wedged between adults. There was no room to move below deck. The air grew thick and hot despite the freezing weather outside. People fainted from the heat and pressure, and there was nowhere for them to fall. Every additional passenger made the ship heavier, slower, and easier to target. Captain Friedrich Petersen had commanded merchant vessels for 22 years. He'd never been in combat. He'd never overseen a military evacuation, and he'd certainly never sailed a ship loaded to 6 times its design capacity. He filed formal objections with Naval Command on January 29. The ship was dangerously overloaded. It had no functioning anti-aircraft guns. It needed a proper escort, minesweepers at minimum, destroyers if possible. He knew the route passed through waters where Soviet submarines had been reported. He knew the Gustloff was slow, even under normal conditions, and with 10,000 people aboard, it would crawl at maybe 12 knots. He knew a single torpedo could kill thousands. The naval logs show his requests were received and acknowledged. They show the exact timestamps, His concerns were noted, then ignored. Then, on January 25th, 5 days before departure, the 2nd Submarine Training Division arrived at the dock. 918 officers and men, full gear, priority boarding. They'd been evacuated from their base in Memel and needed immediate transport west. The Naval Command didn't ask if the Gustloff had space. They ordered Peterson to make room. Entire sections of the promenade deck were cleared. Refugee families moved below to pack the swimming pool area tighter. The submarine officers weren't passengers. They brought their command structure, their ranks, their assumption of authority over anything involving the Kriegsmarine. Most had never served on a surface vessel. Most had no idea how a liner this size handled in winter seas. Among them was Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm, who outranked Peterson and decided he was now in charge. Zahn had commanded U-boats in the Atlantic, survived 3 years of convoy warfare, earned the Knight's Cross. On a submarine, those credentials meant everything. On a 25,000-ton passenger liner loaded with 10,600 people, they meant nothing. Peterson knew the Baltic, knew the ice patterns, knew which routes the Soviet subs patrolled. He proposed a course tight along the Pomeranian coast, where the water was too shallow for submarines to operate safely. Slow, cautious, but survivable. Zahn called it cowardice. He wanted speed, open water, the direct route north, through the deeper channel. A U-boat man's logic: stay submerged or move fast. Never crawl along the coast like prey. He had seniority. He had the Knight's Cross. And he had no experience with surface navigation in hostile waters. The ship's log records the argument in clipped, bureaucratic language. Peterson's objections were noted. Zahn's orders were entered as final. Peterson wanted to hug the coast in shallow water. Zahn overruled him. At 12:30 p.m. on January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff's engines shuddered to life, and the mooring lines were cast off. The sky over Gotenhofen was low and gray. The air, 18 degrees Fahrenheit, ice forming on the railings within minutes. Visibility was under 2 miles. The escort was a single torpedo boat, the Lova, and 2 minesweepers that would only accompany them through the first stretch. A 4th vessel, the torpedo boat, TF-1, was supposed to join, but had been delayed with engine trouble. The Gustloff sat 4 feet lower in the water than her design allowed. Her top speed was supposed to be 15.5 knots. With the overload and the cold seawater intake, she could barely manage 12. Peterson had asked for more escort ships, a destroyer if possible. The answer came back: none available. They cleared the harbor breakwater at 1:08 p.m. and turned northwest into the open Baltic. The deep water channel was 60 miles wide here, depth averaging 180 feet, perfect for submarines. They were 12 hours from open water, moving at 13 knots through a hunting ground. The torpedo boat Love had been assigned to escort the Gustloff through the deep channel. At 1:00 p.m., just hours into the voyage, her engines began overheating. The crew tried to maintain speed, but by 2:30, the mechanical failures forced her to turn back to port. That left the Gustloff with 2 small minesweepers, TF-1 and TF-10, vessels designed to clear mines, not fight submarines. Each displaced roughly 600 tons. Neither carried sonar, and their deck guns were meant for surface threats. The Naval Command radioed assurances that Luftwaffe air cover would patrol overhead at first light. But no aircraft appeared that afternoon. The cloud ceiling sat at 800 feet, visibility dropping as snow squalls moved across the water. The 2 minesweepers stayed close, 1 off each flank, scanning the gray horizon. By late afternoon, they were effectively alone. Below deck, families pressed into compartments designed for 400 that now held 1,500. The heating system had failed in several sections. Mothers wrapped infants in curtains torn from the cabins, trying to block the drafts coming through the ventilation shafts. Survivors later described the smell, a mix of sweat, diesel fumes, and the buckets being used as toilets in hallways. In the lower holds, elderly refugees who'd survived the 70-mile trek from East Prussia were dying from pneumonia and exhaustion, their bodies left in corners because there was nowhere else to put them. Children asked when they'd arrive in safety. Parents told them soon, maybe tomorrow. Some families had been standing for 6 hours straight, no room to sit in the packed corridors. On the upper decks, naval cadets tried to maintain order, handing out blankets and checking that stairwells remained passable. Most had no idea they were sailing into the most dangerous stretch of the Baltic. The Soviet Baltic Fleet had deployed 8 submarines along the German evacuation routes in early January. Their orders, issued directly from Leningrad Command, were explicit: sink all vessels moving west. No distinction between military and civilian targets. The goal was to choke off the Nazi retreat by sea. Soviet intelligence had intercepted German naval traffic, confirming mass evacuations from Gotenhofen and Pillau. Submarines were positioned in a loose arc 15 to 30 miles offshore, waiting in the shipping lanes. Surface patrols had been increased, but the weather kept most Soviet destroyers in port. The subs operated under radio silence, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and receive updated coordinates. Captains were told to prioritize large transports, anything over 5,000 tons. Torpedo rationing was strict: 4 fish per patrol, maybe 6 if a high-value target appeared. By January 30th, most of the submarines had returned to base for resupply. One of those submarines, S-13, had been stalking the route for days. Alexander Marinesko was 32 years old, a Ukrainian sailor who'd risen through the ranks on skill alone. He could read sonar patterns most commanders missed, navigate shallow water in the dark, and bring a submarine home through ice fields that trapped lesser crews. He was also a drinker. In December 1944, he'd vanished on shore leave in Finland for 3 days, turned up drunk in a brothel, and been formally reprimanded by the Baltic Fleet Command. His captain's insignia had been stripped. The January patrol aboard S-13 was widely understood to be his last chance. His crew respected him. His superiors wanted him gone. If he returned to Leningrad without sinking tonnage, he'd face a tribunal, possibly a labor camp. He needed a kill to save his career, and on the afternoon of January 30th, his sonar operator picked up propeller noise. At 7:08 p.m., S-13's hydrophones locked onto the sound. Multiple screws, heavy displacement, moving west at roughly 12 knots. Marinesko ordered the periscope up for 6 seconds. Through the lens, he saw a passenger liner, blacked out, riding low in the water. He ordered a submerged intercept course, tracking by sound alone to avoid detection. The target's speed was sluggish, its heading predictable. Standard doctrine called for a single torpedo at maximum range to conserve ammunition. Marinesko loaded all 4 bow tubes. At 8:16 p.m., the Gustloff's silhouette became visible against the horizon. Then, without explanation, running lights blinked on along the hull. Red, green, white, the full navigation array. The Gustloff was broadcasting its position like a beacon. At 8:05 p.m., the radio operator had received an encoded transmission from Hella Naval Station. A German minesweeper flotilla, M387 and 2 escorts, was steaming east through the same corridor, expected to cross paths within the hour. Standard fleet protocol required civilian vessels to display navigation lights when friendly warships were near to prevent collision. Zahn gave the order immediately. The Gustloff's electricians threw the breakers, and the hull lit up. Crew members on deck froze. One witness later recalled a sailor shouting that they were painting a target for every Soviet submarine in the Baltic. Peterson, still fuming from the earlier route argument, confronted Zahn on the bridge. He argued the minesweepers could navigate by radio contact, that the lights turned the ship into a silhouette against the night sky. Zahn cited regulations, said the risk of a collision with friendly forces outweighed the theoretical submarine threat. Peterson protested, but Zahn's authority held. Marinesco brought S-13 around in a slow arc, watching the target through the periscope. The maneuver took 90 minutes. He closed the distance to 700 meters, close enough to see the ship's profile, but far enough to avoid detection by any escort that might be screening ahead. Inside the submarine, the crew loaded all 4 forward torpedo tubes. The torpedoes were standard 53 centimeters models, each carrying 300 kilograms of TNT. They ran final checks on depth settings and gyro angles, while Marinesco calculated the firing solution by hand. The rangefinder gave a final reading, 950 meters. The target was moving at roughly 12 knots on a steady course. Marinesco ordered the tubes flooded and opened the outer doors. At 9:08 p.m., he gave the order. The first torpedo ran straight and hit the bow just below the waterline. It struck the forward crew quarters, where off-duty submariners from the training division had been sleeping. The explosion tore through the chain locker and flooded the forward compartments in seconds. The sound traveled through the hull like a hammer strike on steel. Passengers in the rear sections felt the deck shudder, heard a muffled boom from somewhere ahead. The bow began to dip as seawater poured in through a rupture 3 meters wide. Officers on the bridge grabbed for support as the ship lurched forward. Captain Peterson reached for the intercom, but the electrical system flickered. The forward bulkheads were already compromised, and the bow was settling lower with each passing second. Passengers on the upper decks barely had time to register the explosion before the second hit. Torpedo 2 struck amidships, 18 seconds after the first. It hit directly beneath the drained swimming pool on E-deck, where more than 400 refugees had packed together for warmth. The explosion punched upward through the floor, and the entire pool structure collapsed inward. The killing was instantaneous for most. The blast wave tore through the confined space, and the collapsing walls crushed those who survived the initial detonation. Seawater flooded in at a rate of several tons per second, filling the compartment in less than 2 minutes. Above deck, passengers heard the second explosion as a deeper, longer rumble. The ship listed 15 degrees to port almost immediately. Bulkhead doors that should have sealed automatically jammed halfway closed, and water began spreading to adjacent compartments through ventilation ducts and stairwells. The lights went out as the third torpedo hit the engine room. The third torpedo tore through the engine room at 9:16 p.m. The blast killed every engineer on duty instantly, severing steam lines and flooding the compartment with scalding water in under 90 seconds. The propellers stopped turning. The pumps that might have slowed the flooding died with the engines. Every light, every radio, every ventilation fan went silent. The ship was now adrift in 18-degree water, taking on an estimated 300 tons per minute through 3 separate breaches. The bow began to settle, and the port list steepened to 20 degrees. In the passenger compartments, the sudden darkness turned confusion into terror. The ship had maybe an hour, but most of the passengers didn't know that yet. The first screams came from E-deck, where seawater was already knee-deep and rising. Families scrambled for the stairwells in total darkness, climbing against the list while the deck tilted beneath them. The main staircases became bottlenecks within minutes. Hundreds of people pushed upward at once, crushing those who fell. Parents lifted children overhead, trying to keep them above the crowd. On the upper decks, crew members shouted contradictory orders. Some directed passengers toward the lifeboats, others toward the stern. The intercom system was dead, so information spread room by room, stairwell by stairwell, mostly through panic. By 9:20 p.m., the list had reached 25 degrees. People on the port side couldn't stand upright anymore. The crew tried to organize an evacuation, but the ship was already dying too fast. The Wilhelm Gustloff carried 22 lifeboats, rated for 408 people each. In theory, they could have saved nearly 9,000. In practice, the cold had welded most of them to their davits, with ice 3 inches thick. Crew members attacked the frozen mechanisms with hammers and axes. They freed 4 boats on the starboard side, but launching them at a 25-degree list meant swinging them out over a tilting deck crowded with thousands of desperate people. The first boat to launch flipped as it hit the water, spilling 60 passengers into the Baltic. The second caught on a twisted davit and hung vertically, dumping its occupants against the hull. A third made it down, but was immediately swamped by people jumping from the deck above. Survivors later described watching lifeboats capsize under the weight of too many hands grabbing the gunwales at once. Of 22 lifeboats, only a handful made it into the water intact. Below deck, hundreds of refugees were trapped behind locked doors. The Navy had sealed compartments from the outside to control movement and prevent overcrowding in sensitive areas. Standard procedure during wartime transport. When the torpedoes hit, crew members scrambled through flooded corridors, trying to unlock them in total darkness. Survivors on upper decks reported hearing screaming from below, muffled by steel bulkheads. The sound grew fainter as water rose through the lower levels. One crewman later testified he reached a compartment door and found the lock mechanism jammed by the ship's distortion. He could hear people pounding on the other side. The water was already waist-deep in the passageway, rising fast. In the chaos, with the ship listing severely and power failing, many locks were simply never reached. Some doors were never opened. More than 4,000 children under 16 were aboard the Gustloff that night. Most were traveling without fathers, who'd been killed in combat or were still fighting on the Eastern Front. Mothers carried infants wrapped in whatever fabric they had. Survivor accounts describe families torn apart in the surge toward the tilting deck. Parents handed children to strangers climbing the stairs, hoping someone higher up had a better chance. One woman recalled a mother passing her baby through a porthole to someone on a raft, then disappearing back into the ship. In the water, infants died within minutes. The Baltic Sea temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Adults who made it into the water described the silence that followed the initial splashes, punctuated only by the wind. Rescue ships pulled small bodies from the waves hours later, frozen solid in their mother's arms. The youngest survivors would later have no memory of that night, only the cold. The 2nd Submarine Training Division occupied dedicated quarters on the upper decks, closest to the lifeboats and life rafts. When the ship began sinking, these officers had direct access to the boat deck. Many made it off. Of the roughly 1,000 submariners aboard, over 400 survived. That's a survival rate near 40%. Among the refugees trapped in lower compartments, the rate was under 5%. Survivors later accused the officers of commandeering lifeboats while civilians drowned below. One witness reported seeing uniformed men forming a line to keep refugees away from a lifeboat as it was lowered. Another described an officer cutting the rope of a raft to prevent more people from climbing on. These accounts were disputed, but the numbers remain. The ship's commander, Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Zahn, had been on the bridge when the torpedoes struck. He gave orders for evacuation, then made his way to the tilting deck as the Gustloff went down. Korvettenkapitän Zahn was pulled from the water alive. The deck was tilting at 30 degrees, then 40 degrees. Survivors who were still aboard lost their footing and slid forward into the darkness, slamming into ventilation shafts and bulkheads as they went. Others jumped from the railings before the angle became too steep, hitting the water from heights that broke bones on impact. The bow was completely submerged now, dragging the rest of the ship down with it. People still clinging to the stern railings were lifted higher into the air as the ship pivoted. Some held on, waiting for the water to reach them. Others let go and fell 60, 70, 80 feet into the black surface below. Inside, the corridors were flooded to the ceiling. The emergency lights had failed. In the darkness, survivors described hearing the groan of metal tearing, the rush of water behind sealed doors, and the muffled sounds of people trapped in compartments that would never be opened. At 10:18 p.m., 70 minutes after the first torpedo, the stern lifted vertical. The Gustloff went under in 45 seconds. The stern, now pointing straight up like a monument, slid beneath the surface with a sound witnesses described as a roar. The suction pulled swimmers back toward the ship, dragging them under even as they kicked toward open water. As the cold seawater hit the boilers deep in the engine room, they exploded. The blast sent a shockwave through the water, killing some swimmers instantly and rupturing the lungs of others. Air pockets trapped inside the hull burst free, sending debris and bodies to the surface in violent eruptions. The noise carried for miles. Ships in the convoy heard it, the low rumble followed by a hiss as the last of the air escaped. Then the surface settled, littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and thousands of people struggling to stay afloat. Then there was only the screaming and the cold. The Baltic Sea in late January held a water temperature of 39 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, without a life jacket, survival time averaged 15 minutes before hypothermia induced unconsciousness. With a life jacket, you might last 30. Most of the people in the water had neither. Hypothermia set in within 5 minutes. Survivors described their limbs going numb, their breathing becoming shallow, their thinking slowing to the point where they forgot to kick. The wounded, already weakened by injuries from the explosions, went under first. Then the elderly. Then the children who couldn't generate enough body heat to fight the cold. The lifeboats and rafts that had launched successfully were overloaded, sitting low in the water, taking on waves. Swimmers grabbed at the sides, begging to be pulled aboard. Most were pushed away. There wasn't room, and if too many climbed on, everyone would go under. Help was coming, but it was hours away. The radio operator had gotten a distress call out before the power failed completely. The position he transmitted was approximate, cobbled together in the chaos, and the message itself cut off mid-transmission. Other German ships in the area picked up fragments. Some heard coordinates that put the Gustloff 10 miles from where she actually was. Others heard nothing at all, just static and then silence. The nearest vessels were scattered across the Baltic, running their own evacuation routes or patrolling for submarines. Most were small, coastal craft with no real capacity for a rescue operation of this scale. They had to decide whether to turn toward an uncertain position in submarine-infested waters, in the dark, in a storm. The torpedo boat Lova, the same one that had turned back with mechanical trouble, picked up the signal. Lova arrived at the scene shortly before midnight, more than 2 hours after the Gustloff went under. 2 minesweepers, T-36 and TF-19, came in behind her. They swept the area with spotlights, cutting through the darkness and the snow. The beams caught wreckage first: deck chairs, life vests, luggage, pieces of hull. Then bodies, hundreds of them, floating face down in clusters. Most wore life jackets, but had already frozen to death in water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The crews threw lines and lowered nets. They hauled up anyone who moved, anyone who could grab hold. Some survivors had been in the water for over 2 hours. Their clothes were frozen solid, their skin blue, their hands too numb to grip the ropes. They pulled 472 people from the water. The final count, combining those rescued by the 3 ships and a handful picked up by other vessels over the following hours, came to roughly 1,000 survivors. That left approximately 9,000 dead. The exact number was never confirmed because the passenger manifest had gone down with the ship. The survivors were brought to ports in Sassnitz and Kolberg. Makeshift morgues were set up in warehouses and naval facilities to handle the bodies recovered in the days after. Most were never identified. They were buried in mass graves along the coast, marked with wooden crosses that listed only the date. In Gotenhafen, where the Gustloff had departed, authorities sealed the embarkation records. In Kiel, Naval Headquarters logged the loss in classified files. The ship had carried civilian refugees, wounded soldiers, naval personnel, and submarine trainees, all mixed together in a single, chaotic manifest that no longer existed. The Reich ordered the survivors to silence. Goebbels' propaganda ministry issued the directive within hours. No newspapers would mention the Gustloff. No radio broadcasts would acknowledge the loss. Survivors arriving at coastal towns were met by Gestapo officers who made the terms clear. Speak about what happened. Face court-martial for defeatism. The Reich was collapsing. Berlin would fall in 89 days. In that final chaos, the classified files in Kiel were either destroyed or simply abandoned. The ship's manifest, the passenger lists, the radio logs, all of it vanished into the administrative disintegration of a dying regime. Survivors scattered across occupied Germany, many into Soviet-controlled territory. They carried the memory, but no proof, no documentation, no official acknowledgement that the sinking had even occurred. The Gustloff became a story told in whispers, if it was told at all. When the war ended, the silence only deepened. Alexander Marinesko returned to Leningrad, expecting a hero's welcome. The Soviet Navy confirmed his kill, logged the tonnage, and then opened an investigation. The question wasn't whether he'd sunk the Gustloff, it was whether he should have. Soviet intelligence had intercepted German transmissions about the ship's passenger load. Naval Command knew it carried thousands of civilians. Some officials argued a refugee vessel wasn't a legitimate military target under international law, even if it flew a military flag and carried armed personnel. Marinesko received no medal. Instead, he was removed from submarine duty for what his file called disciplinary issues, a euphemism for the drunkenness and insubordination that had marked his service. He worked in a supply depot, then a construction site, his wartime record quietly buried. He died in obscurity in 1963, but the Soviet Navy wasn't finished with his story. In the West, the Gustloff didn't exist. British and American naval historians cataloged wartime losses, documented convoy attacks, analyzed U-boat campaigns. The largest maritime disaster in history appeared in none of it. Cold War politics made the omission convenient. Acknowledging the Gustloff meant acknowledging a Soviet atrocity against civilians at a time when NATO and Warsaw Pact tensions demanded simpler narratives. German survivors, many trapped behind the Iron Curtain, had no platform. Those in the West found little appetite for their testimony when the Holocaust consumed all attention to German suffering. A few historians tried. In 1955, a German naval officer named Heinz Schoen began collecting survivor accounts, working from scattered letters and fading memories. He published a small circulation book in 1952 that naval archives largely ignored. The story stayed buried in footnotes and out-of-print memoirs. It would take a novelist to bring the Gustloff back into public memory. The West German Navy quietly opened an investigation in 1956. Officers tracked down surviving crew members and passengers, conducting interviews in Hamburg, Kiel, and Flensburg. They pieced together passenger manifests, cross-referenced Red Cross lists, and tried to calculate how many people had actually been aboard. The debate centered on Captain Zahn's choices that night. Should he have sailed closer to shore, where shallow water might have slowed the sinking? Should he have zigzagged, despite the ice and the crowding? The reports remained classified, stamped with security codes that kept them out of public archives. Survivors gave conflicting accounts. Some remembered Zahn ordering lifeboats launched. Others recalled only chaos, officers abandoning posts, no clear commands. One investigator noted that the ship's logbook went down with the wreck, leaving no official record of the final decisions. The findings blamed Zahn, but he was never charged. In 1964, a group of survivors formed the Wilhelm Gustloff Memorial Association. They pooled money to commission a small bronze plaque in Lübeck, near the harbor where many refugees had boarded. Local officials debated for 8 months before approving the installation, worried the memorial would be seen as Nazi nostalgia. A second plaque went up in Gotenhofen in 1968, now Gdynia, Poland. Polish authorities removed it within 6 weeks. The inscription mentioned German civilians fleeing Soviet forces, a framing Warsaw found unacceptable. Survivor groups tried again in 1972, with a memorial in Damp, a coastal town in Schleswig-Holstein. Protesters arrived on the dedication day, holding signs that read, "Remember Auschwitz first." The memorials attracted hate mail. Survivor Association leaders received letters accusing them of downplaying the Holocaust, of rewriting Germany as victim rather than perpetrator. One organizer kept a file of the threats, over 300 pages by 1975. Every attempt to memorialize the Gustloff triggered accusations of minimizing other atrocities. Historians couldn't agree on a death toll. Official German Navy records listed 5,348 passengers and crew, but those counts only included registered evacuees with boarding passes, refugees who rushed aboard in the final hours, families who slipped past checkpoints, weren't logged. Some estimates pushed the total to 10,600. East German researchers in the 1970s used a lower figure, around 6,000, citing incomplete manifests and exaggerated survivor testimony. West German scholars countered with Red Cross missing person files and testimony from harbor officials in Gotenhofen who saw the docks that night. The gap wasn't just academic. A higher toll reinforced narratives of Soviet brutality. A lower toll made the sinking less exceptional, easier to fold into the broader context of war. Archival work in the 1990s and 2000s cross-referenced survivor lists, casualty records, and pre-boarding censuses from refugee camps. Researchers identified individual passengers by name, traced their embarkation points, and counted how many never appeared in post-war records. The most thorough research suggests the true number is around 9,400. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not alone. Operation Hannibal evacuated over 2 million people across the Baltic in 3 months, using everything from battleships to fishing trawlers. At least 25,000 refugees died in those crossings, spread across dozens of sinkings. The Goya went down 2 months later, with 6,000 aboard. The General von Steuben sank in February, with 3,500. The Cap Arcona burned in Lübeck Bay, with 5,000 concentration camp prisoners locked below deck. Each one dwarfed the Titanic's 1,500 dead. But the Gustloff remains the single deadliest maritime disaster in recorded history. The Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The Lusitania took 18 minutes. The Gustloff took 45 minutes and killed 6 times as many. Yet most people today can name the captain of the Titanic. Almost no one knows the name of the Gustloff's master. The Titanic had movies and memorials. The Gustloff had silence. In 1973, nearly 3 decades after the war, the Soviet Union broke its silence. Alexander Marinesko, the S-13 commander, was posthumously declared a hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor. The official citation called the Gustloff a legitimate military target carrying Wehrmacht troops and Kriegsmarine personnel. Soviet propaganda framed it as a triumph of naval warfare. Marinesko had been court-martialed in 1945 for drunkenness and dereliction, stripped of his command, and assigned to a penal battalion. He died in 1963, disgraced and alcoholic, never knowing he would be rehabilitated. The 1973 recognition coincided with Cold War tensions and a renewed push to glorify the Soviet role in defeating fascism. State media published accounts of the attack, calling it the greatest torpedo strike of the war. Books appeared celebrating Marinesko as a forgotten hero. The new narrative emphasized the ship's military markings, its naval escorts, and the presence of U-boat trainees aboard. The citation made no mention of the women and children in the lower decks. Under international law, the case exists in a gray zone that has never been resolved. The Gustloff was painted naval gray, not the white with a red cross of a hospital ship. It carried anti-aircraft guns, military personnel, and over 1,000 naval auxiliaries and submariners. It sailed under armed escort as part of an active military evacuation. But the 1929 Geneva Convention protecting civilians in wartime did not cover maritime evacuations in any detail. The Hague Conventions of 1907 defined lawful targets as vessels in military service, but they predated the concept of total war and mass civilian flight. No treaty in 1945 addressed a ship that was simultaneously a naval auxiliary and a refugee transport. Modern legal scholars remain divided. Some argue Marinesko had no way to know the passenger manifest and acted within the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare that all sides practiced. Others point out that by 1945, the Nazi regime itself had blurred every line between combatant and civilian, military asset and refugee ship. No tribunal ever examined the sinking. No investigation assigned blame. The question of whether it was a war crime, a tragedy, or simply an inevitable consequence of collapse has never been adjudicated. In 1945, no one was counting the rules anymore. For 58 years, the wreck sat undisturbed on the seabed. No one knew exactly where it was. The Baltic is cold, dark, and quiet at 60 meters. In 2003, a joint Polish-German expedition using side-scan sonar mapped the coordinates. The wreck lies in international waters, 30 kilometers off the Polish coast. Under maritime law, it's a war grave. Both governments classified it as protected. The sonar revealed the hull broken into major sections, tilted on its side. No attempt was made to raise anything. The team agreed documentation was enough. But documentation means cameras. The footage showed debris spread across a kilometer, and something else. The hull split into two main pieces when it sank. The bow section rests upright. The stern lies on its side, torn open where the torpedoes struck. The impact craters are still visible in the plating. Around the wreck, the seabed is littered with personal effects. Shoes, suitcases, children's toys, all preserved in the cold water. Cameras captured a porcelain doll, a leather bag still intact, scattered clothing. The wreck is remarkably well preserved because of the depth and temperature. Rust progresses slowly, but it's deteriorating. Polish authorities patrol the area, though enforcement is difficult in open water. Divers are forbidden, but that hasn't stopped everyone. Reports began surfacing in the 2000s of unauthorized dives. Artifact hunters, thrill seekers, salvage operators. Some claimed to be documenting history. Others were less subtle about their motives. International waters complicate prosecution. Polish and German law forbids disturbing the site, but enforcement depends on catching divers in the act. Most descents happen at night. Equipment is smuggled aboard fishing vessels. Survivor families were outraged when they learned. Eva Dorn Rothman, who lost 22 relatives, called it grave robbery. Organizations representing victims demanded tougher penalties. Poland increased patrols, but the site is remote. Pieces of the Gustloff have appeared on the black market. For 57 years, the Gustloff was barely mentioned in German literature. Then, in 2002, Nobel Prize winner Günter Grass published a novella called Crab Walk. It told the story of the sinking through 3 generations of a fictional family. Grass had been aboard a nearby ship that night in 1945. He'd watched the sky light up with flares. The book became an instant bestseller, translated into 30 languages, and suddenly, the Western world was learning the name Wilhelm Gustloff for the first time. In Germany, the reaction split along generational lines. Younger readers were shocked they'd never heard of it. Older Germans said it was about time someone told the truth. Historians and Jewish leaders warned that the timing was dangerous, that neo-Nazi groups were already citing the book to equate Allied bombings with the Holocaust. Grass defended the work as a warning against forgetting, but the damage was done. Conservative politicians used the novella to push for a national memorial to German wartime suffering. Grass was accused of rehabilitating German victimhood. The Gustloff became a flashpoint in what Germans call the Opferdebatte, the victim debate. Could you mourn German civilians killed in the war without diluting the guilt of the Nazi state? Could you hold both truths at once, or did naming one erase the other? Critics argued that focusing on German suffering created a false equivalence, that the 9,000 dead on the Gustloff were fleeing a regime their country had built. Defenders countered that children and elderly refugees bore no responsibility for the Third Reich's crimes, that their deaths deserved acknowledgement without political calculus. The debate cut through families. Grandchildren demanded their grandparents' stories be told. Historians warned that right-wing groups were weaponizing those stories to rewrite the war as a tragedy, with no clear villain. Surveys showed Germans under 40 were far more willing to discuss German wartime losses than those over 60, who remembered the shame of the post-war years. By 2005, the argument had moved from academia into parliament, into museums, into high school curriculums. The Gustloff became a proxy war over who gets to be mourned. In the 1990s, a handful of survivors began to speak publicly. Helga Reuter was 83 when she gave her first recorded interview in 1998. She described the moment the torpedo hit, the sound of the steel hull tearing, the silence that followed. She'd been 22 and 6 months pregnant. Oral history projects in Germany and Poland raced to document the testimonies before the generation disappeared. By 2000, researchers estimated fewer than 300 survivors were still alive. By 2010, that number had dropped below 50. The accounts shared common threads: the cold, the darkness, the impossibility of distinguishing children's screams from adults. Rintu Shinkor East waited until 2003 to tell her story. She'd been 4 years old on the ship, clutching a doll her mother had sewn from a potato sack. She remembered being handed up through the hatch, the feeling of strangers' arms, the doll slipping into the water. She never saw her mother again. Interviewer after interviewer asked the same question: why did you wait so long? The answers were nearly identical. It was too painful. No one wanted to hear it. Germany had moved on. Most said they never spoke of it, even to their own children. German psychologists who studied the survivors in the 1980s found PTSD patterns unlike anything documented in civilian disasters. The trauma wasn't just the sinking. It was the decades of enforced silence, the Cold War displacement, the guilt of having escaped when a spouse or child didn't. Survivors' guilt ran through nearly every interview. Women who'd climbed into lifeboats while their mothers stayed below. Men who'd pushed past families to reach the deck. One nurse who'd survived said she couldn't touch her own children for years without seeing the frozen infants she'd left on the promenade. Comparative studies placed Gustloff survivors alongside those from Titanic, Lusitania, and Andrea Doria. The difference was duration of terror. Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Gustloff went down in under 70 minutes, in water cold enough to kill in 15. The psychological imprint was sharper, more compressed. And then there were the cases that broke the researchers. One survivor insisted for 60 years that her daughter was still alive. Of the roughly 1,200 survivors, fewer than 50 were children under 5. Most had no memory of the ship itself, just fragments. Cold, screaming, a sensation of falling. Many were told they'd survived a different disaster entirely, or no disaster at all. A boy rescued at 18 months was raised believing his mother had died in an air raid. He was 40 when a cousin mentioned the name Gustloff. Another child, found floating on debris, was adopted by a Polish fisherman who never explained where she came from. She grew up thinking she was Polish. Reunion registries in the 1990s tried to connect survivors who'd been separated as infants. A handful succeeded. Most hit dead ends. Records were scattered across 4 countries, and East Germany had classified survivor lists until 1989. The children who did reconnect often found they remembered different ships, different nights. Some only learned the truth when a researcher tracked them down. Genealogists trying to reconstruct passenger lists face an archival nightmare. The Gustloff's manifest was incomplete to begin with. Refugees boarded without tickets, without names recorded. Entire families are known only by surname or by a single surviving relative's testimony decades later. A project launched in 2004 used refugee registration cards, Red Cross tracing files, and survivor interviews to cross-reference 12,000 possible victims. It confirmed 2,700 names. The rest remain gaps. One DNA effort in 2011 tried to match descendants with remains recovered by Polish divers, but the wreck is too deep and too deteriorated for systematic recovery. What makes it worse is how many families vanished entirely. No survivor, no one to file a missing person report. A mother, father, and 3 children boarding in Gotenhafen, never heard from again, with no living relative to remember their names. Historians estimate 400 to 600 such family units were lost. Thousands are recorded only as unknown woman or unknown child. The first memorial went up in 1995, a granite stone in Danholm, near the boarding port. It lists no names, only a number, over 9,000 dead. A second appeared in Berlin in 2005, commissioned by a survivors association, its text revised 3 times before installation. In Gdynia, the city that was once Gotenhafen, a small plaque was placed at the ferry terminal in 2008. The Polish text calls the victims refugees and wounded. The German translation uses civilian passengers. City Council debated the wording for 14 months. Scattered across northern Germany, towns erected smaller stones for local victims. Rostock, Hamburg, Stettin. Most were funded by family groups that dissolved within a decade as the last survivors aged out. The inscriptions are careful, neutral, scrubbed of context. No memorial names the submarine. No memorial explains why the ship was targeted. No memorial mentions the word war crime, and none call it an accident. Every inscription is a negotiation. Poland inherited the wreck in 1945, when borders redrawn at Yalta placed the entire coast under Warsaw's control. Gotenhafen became Gdynia. The naval base was repurposed. The pier, where 10,582 people boarded, now services container ships. For decades, Polish authorities treated the site as a restricted zone, partly because Soviet naval patrols claimed jurisdiction over the seabed, partly because acknowledging German civilian deaths was politically inconvenient. Dive permits were denied without explanation. In the 2000s, as Poland joined the EU and historical commissions opened archives, the conversation shifted. Gdynia's mayor called the Gustloff a tragedy for all nations. But no city funds were allocated for commemorative projects. Private groups paid for the plaque. Tour boats now pass over the wreck, 42 meters down, en routes to Hell Peninsula. Some captains mention it, most don't. The Baltic holds an estimated 100 shipwrecks from the war, many with bodies still inside. Gdynia built a maritime museum that mentions the Gustloff in a single room. In Russia, Alexander Marinesko is a national hero. His portrait hangs in the Naval Museum in St. Petersburg. A 2006 documentary, state-funded, called The Sinking, the Greatest Submarine Success in History. The refugee count is mentioned once, dismissed as enemy personnel. Official Russian histories published since 2000 repeat the same framing. The Gustloff was a military transport carrying Wehrmacht troops, therefore a legal target under naval law. The 9,343 civilians are described as auxiliary staff, or displaced persons evacuating military zones. Marinesko died in 1963, not yet recognized. The Soviet Navy initially reprimanded him for the patrol, citing navigational errors and failure to confirm the kill. His Hero of the Soviet Union award came posthumously in 1990, pushed by veterans groups after Glasnost. In 2010, a bust of Marinesko was unveiled in Kronstadt. In 2015, a Russian naval history textbook for cadets included the Gustloff attack as a case study in decisive action under uncertainty. The chapter does not list the dead by category. In Kaliningrad, a street is named for Marinesko. In 2003, a far-right party in Germany used footage of the Gustloff in campaign materials. The tagline read, "Never forget." The ad was pulled after 48 hours, but the pattern had been set. For decades, nationalist movements across Europe have invoked the ship as proof that German civilians suffered equally, that the war's moral calculus is more complicated than the trials suggested. In Poland, some historians countered by pointing out that the ship was carrying military personnel, that it was a legitimate target under the rules of the time. Both sides distort. The ship was carrying refugees, wounded soldiers, and naval auxiliaries in unknown proportions. But the invocation itself, the rhetorical use of 9,000 deaths, has made some scholars hesitant to discuss the event at all, afraid their work will be weaponized. In 2017, a memorial service in northern Germany drew protesters from both flanks. One group held signs reading, "Remember the victims." Another held signs reading, "Remember the cause." The ship has become a symbol wielded by those who never saw the wreckage. In 1948, the International Maritime Organization convened a working group to review the laws governing evacuation vessels in wartime. The Gustloff was referenced 17 times in the draft report. The final treaty was ratified in 1960. It required hospital ships to carry only wounded combatants and medical staff, no weapons, and to transmit their positions continuously. Refugee ships, however, remained undefined. The treaty covered vessels under the Geneva Convention, but said nothing about civilian transports pressed into military service. In 1974, amendments added protections for lifeboats and rescue craft, but the core question, whether a ship carrying both civilians and military personnel loses its protected status, was left to the discretion of belligerents. Legal scholars still debate whether the S-13 violated international law or followed it. In 2004, a maritime law textbook at Annapolis included the Gustloff as a case study under the chapter Dual-Use Vessels and Targeting Decisions. The conclusion states that the attack was lawful under the conventions of the time. A footnote adds that the conventions of the time were inadequate. The laws changed, but the ambiguities remain. 10 days after the Gustloff sank, the S-13 torpedoed another refugee ship, the General von Steuben. 3,000 people drowned in 15 minutes. 7 weeks later, the Goya, a freighter packed with wounded soldiers and refugees, was hit by Soviet torpedoes in the same waters. Estimates put the dead at over 6,000. The Cap Arcona, sunk by British bombers in Lubeck Bay in May 1945, killed another 5,000, most of them concentration camp prisoners the SS had forced aboard. Operation Hannibal, the evacuation of East Prussia, involved over 1,000 vessels and lasted from January to May 1945. Historians estimate that between 20,000 and 25,000 people died at sea during those months, most in incidents that were never formally recorded. The Goya has no confirmed manifest. The Steuben's passenger list was lost in the chaos of the final weeks. No memorials mark their sinking sites. In 1995, a German naval historian published a study comparing the death tolls of every major naval disaster in modern history. The Titanic killed 1,517. The Lusitania killed 1,198. The combined sinkings of the Baltic evacuation exceeded them all. Together, the Baltic evacuation killed more people at sea than any other naval campaign in history. Operation Hannibal moved 2.4 million people across the Baltic in 15 weeks. At least 25,000 drowned. The Gustloff accounted for roughly 9,400 of those deaths, a third of the total. Dunkirk evacuated 338,000 in 9 days and lost fewer than 4,000. The fall of Saigon moved 130,000 by air and sea with minimal casualties. Hannibal dwarfed them both, in scale and in loss. The numbers tell two stories. 99% of the refugees made it across, but the 1% who didn't died in the coldest water in Europe, in ships that should never have sailed. The evacuation was a catastrophe and a miracle at the same time. Zahn had 3 routes out of Gotenhafen. The shallow coastal lane hugged the shore at depths under 30 meters, too shallow for Soviet subs to dive and maneuver. The middle route split the difference. The deep channel ran through water 60 to 80 meters deep, open hunting grounds. He chose the deep route and turned on the navigation lights. His reasoning, speed and visibility mattered more than stealth. The coastal route added hours and risked mines. Post-war analysts ran the probabilities. A submarine in shallow water fires blind, with one chance. In deep water, it stalks, circles, fires again. The S-13 tracked the Gustloff for 2 hours before firing. Marinesco later said the lights made it easy. He surfaced, confirmed the target, submerged, closed to 700 meters, and launched 4 torpedoes. Most historians agree. The shallow coastal route would have saved the ship. No one was ever charged. The Nuremberg trials focused on concentration camps and territorial aggression, not maritime disasters. The Gustloff didn't fit the narrative. Marinesco received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal in 1990, 45 years late. Zahn faced no tribunal. He settled in West Germany, worked quietly, and avoided the press. The legal problem was jurisdictional. The sinking happened in a war zone under military command. The ship carried troops, making it a legitimate target under international law. Prosecuting Zahn meant admitting the refugees were being used as shields. The German government never opened a formal inquiry. Survivor groups called for one in 1955, again in 1965. Both times, the Ministry of Defense declined, citing lack of evidence and the passage of time. Zahn gave one interview in 1963, then never spoke of it again. The passenger manifest, the one document that could have told us exactly who was aboard, was kept in Berlin. It burned in an Allied air raid, along with the boarding records the harbor office had rushed to compile in those last chaotic days. So the numbers historians work with aren't counts. They're reconstructions, built backward from ration cards, lifeboat lists, and the memories of people who were 9 years old at the time. The other half of the story sat in Soviet hands. Marinesco's after-action reports, the submarine's log, the command chatter around the attack, all of it went into naval archives and stayed there, classified, for decades. A researcher in West Germany couldn't touch it. A researcher in East Germany didn't dare ask. So for 40 years, the wreck existed in two versions that never met. Western survivors remembered the cold and the screaming. Soviet doctrine remembered a legitimate military target and little else. When the Soviet files opened in the 90s, they revealed something unexpected. The patrol logs confirmed the mechanics almost exactly as survivors described them. 3 torpedoes fired, 3 impacts, the bow, the empty crew quarters, the engine room. Marinesko had scrawled a message on each one before launch, and the timeline in his own hand matched the sinking down to the minute, ending a decades-long argument about whether it was even his boat. But the files held something heavier than confirmation. Internal notes show Soviet command hesitated over whether to publicize the kill at all. There was awareness, in the reports and the debates that followed, that the ship had not been packed with soldiers. It had been packed with refugees, women, children, the wounded. And that awareness is why the victory was quietly shelved instead of celebrated. The hesitation wasn't abstract. One memo, dated February 12, 1945, argued the Gustloff carried military personnel and anti-aircraft guns, making it a legitimate target. Another, written 3 days later, noted the presence of women and children, but concluded the armament justified the strike under wartime rules. What they didn't mention in official channels was the scale. Soviet naval intelligence had estimated 1,500 aboard based on typical troop transport capacity. The actual number was closer to 10,600. The gap between assumption and reality meant no one in Moscow initially understood what Marinesko had done. His own report listed the target as a troop transport, 25,000 tons, sunk in 70 minutes. The tonnage was inflated, the passenger count absent. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal in 1990, 45 years late, after decades of being sidelined for unrelated disciplinary issues. The delay had nothing to do with the Gustloff and everything to do with his reputation for drinking and insubordination. This is where the historical record concludes. A ship constructed to transport workers on holiday, sunk with thousands aboard. Its manifest destroyed. Its attacker honored belatedly and with hesitation. Its story divided between two nations, each preserving only their own version. Zahn granted a single interview and remained silent thereafter. The files that eventually surfaced offered no exoneration. They only rendered the silence comprehensible. For those drawn to cases like this, further accounts await.